Hello everybody and welcome to this Learning and Work Institute event on the DWP's Restart programme and how we can help tackle long-term unemployment and also support better work more generally. This event is being held as part of our Better Work network, and we're grateful for the support of the Trust for London in putting on that network. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. So if you're on Twitter, you can tweet away and you can tag in our account, which is @LearnWorkUK, or you can also use the hashtag BWNRestart. So get tweeting away, and also please do put some of your comments and questions in the Q&A. We will be putting as many of those as possible to the speakers later in the event, so please do pop those questions in there. So just before I introduce the speakers, perhaps just a couple of bits of background from me. So we know that the pandemic's had a really stark impact on the labour market. Unemployment's increased significantly. We think it would have increased by another 2.5 million were it not for the furlough scheme protecting millions of jobs. So it could have been a lot worse. And now we're starting to think about, what does recovery look like? So the economy is reopening, notwithstanding the extension of step 3 restrictions in England and similarly elsewhere in the UK, but we are reopening. Vacancies are back up to pre-pandemic levels across the UK. London was the last region, I think, to get up to that mark. And we're starting to see now increases in employment as businesses create jobs as the economy reopens, as well as a reduction in the number of people furloughed. But recovery is going to be a multi-year task. In the past 3 recessions, it's taken, I think, up to 7 years for employment to recover after a recession. So even if the economy bounces back, take the labour market longer. And we've also seen already, I think, something like a 40% rise in long-term unemployment over the last year. So whilst unemployment hasn't risen by as much as you might expect, it's still risen quite a bit, and that's now feeding through into long-term unemployment. And that's really worrying, because long-term unemployment is bad for people's health, for people's well-being, for the economy, for employers, and also, of course, for individuals' job prospects. The longer you're out of work, the less likely you are to find work. So that's why it's good to see the DWP's plan for jobs, talking about lots of interventions to try and limit the rises in unemployment, but also its Restart programme, which is probably, I guess, its main intervention to try and help those who do become long-term unemployed back to work. So that's what we really want to focus on today. And I guess some really big questions for me would be, how is that going to match the need that's out there? So we're seeing a big spike in long-term unemployment now, as I mentioned, but actually, if the economy does bounce back a bit, might we not see the volumes of long-term unemployed people that we were expecting back when the programme was announced by the Chancellor last year? And if so, can we make sure that we use that capacity that we've invested in as taxpayers to help those who are already long-term unemployed or economically inactive before the crisis? So not just trying to recover from the impacts of the pandemic, but looking ahead to how we build a better labour market and a better, more inclusive economy. Secondly, how will Restart fit with everything else that's going on? So the employment and skills systems are massively complicated. If you name almost any 3 letters in combination, that's probably a programme that's either existed, currently exists, or will exist in the next few years. So how does Restart fit with apprenticeships, traineeships, job centre plus support more generally, local authority driven support, and the list goes on? So how do we fit it within that context? And then thirdly, what do we think about the types of employment we're going to be getting people back into? And that's both about the effects of the pandemic on the structure of the economy. So are we all going to kind of rush back to the office and queue up at various sandwich establishments at lunchtime, or actually is the pattern of employment going to change, and what impact does that have on employment programmes? But also, before the pandemic, we were talking about better work and good work and work with opportunities to progress. So how can we make sure that that's built into Restart and all of those other employment and skills initiatives as well? So we're focusing on good work and that progression as well. So 3 pretty straightforward, easy questions there for our panelists to try and answer. As I say, please do put your thoughts and questions into the Q&A box in the app, and tweet away about it as well. So we've got 3 speakers to kick us off before we then open it up to get in some of those questions. Really pleased that we have Gareth Parry, who's the Programme Director for Remploy and Maximus People Services, one of the organisations that's going to be delivering the Restart programme. So he'll be able to talk a little bit about how they're going to hopefully answer some of those questions in their delivery. We also have Mark Hilton, who's the Executive Director of People at London First, the business representative organisation. And ultimately, you can't have employment without employers. So how are we going to make sure that employers engage? What are we asking of employers? And how do we make sure the offer meets their needs as well? And then also Kim Chaplin, the Associate Director for Work at the Centre for Ageing Better. We've done lots of work with the Centre for Ageing Better around the fact that some previous employment programmes, for example, haven't worked as well for older people. So without stealing her thunder or preempting her, she may want to talk about some of those issues and what we can do about them as well. So that's the order we're going to run through in. Before I go to the first speaker, though, we do have a poll for everyone to please vote on in the app. So if we could just bring up the poll, please. So you can click on the poll tab in the app. So the question is, what more do we need to do so that Restart works and we get people into good work? So we've got 4 options there. You can only have a limited number of options. There's probably a bunch of things we haven't thought about or we couldn't fit in. So do pop those in the Q&A as well. But should we have a greater focus on earnings outcomes and getting employers to sign up to good work? Would that be a good thing to boost Restart and make sure it makes a contribution to those wider policy goals that we have? Second option is, do we need more learning and skills support? This is something we've talked about at Learning and Work Institute before, please in the name of the organisation, I suppose. And then the third option is, it's quite a centrally driven programme in the sense that it was designed and commissioned by DWP with a degree of local input to some extent in the commissioning. But actually, should we have more local responsibility and greater devolution? Although fourthly, you may think, I don't know if there's anyone from DWP on the event, but you may think whether or not you're from DWP, that actually this is all sorted and we just need to crack on with it. So we don't need to do anything more. So please do get voting away, and I'll give the results of the poll a bit later on, just before we open up for questions and debate. To kick us off then, so as I say, I posed 3 pretty straightforward, easy questions, so I'm sure we can wrap this up in half an hour tops. So really pleased to welcome Gareth to talk a little bit about his perspective and the perspective of Maximus as one of the leading organisations delivering Restart. So Gareth, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Absolutely delighted to join the conference today. Quite excited actually, because this is the first public speech I've given on Restart, so I'll be interested in any feedback I get later. I'm going to keep my presentation relatively high level. It probably won't really answer some of those questions, but I think we can get into some of that in the Q&A if that's okay. So what I've really tried to focus on is give people a sense of what is Restart, what its objectives are, and a little bit of a sense about how we, Maximus, as one of the providers, plan to deliver it. So if we can move on to the next slide. That would be great. So these are the scheme objectives set by DWP. So it's about supporting long-term unemployed people into sustainable work. It is designed to be locally tailored, although it's a huge national programme across England and Wales. I think the challenge to providers was, how do you take a large-scale provision and how do you localise it and make it relevant to local labour markets and local boroughs? So I think that's something that we've all designed in. We're challenged with making sure that the programme provides value for money, so there's a good return on investment for the department. Just to put put into context, this is the single biggest employment programme the Department of Work and Pensions has ever commissioned. So that's great in terms of its determination to respond to the impact of COVID, but obviously we've got to make sure there's payback for that, and we as providers need to deliver that, and we need to make sure that from what we're doing, we're delivering an evidence base that shows what works. So they're the high level scheme objectives set by the department. So if we can move on to the next slide. So this is just very high details. The contracts are for 4 years. It's 3 years of referrals with 12 months of support for individuals. So it's a 4-year contract in effect. Programme wide, the programme hopes to be able to support around about 1.4 million UK claimants. In London, that's split into 2 contracts, so 174,000 people split in 1 contract. In West and Central London, that's going to be delivered by Ingis. And then in South and East London, where we'll be delivering it, 117,000. Eligibility, as we've said, 12 to 18 months, and technically it's a mandatory programme, although I think the spirit of the delivery is voluntary, but it is technically a mandatory programme. And we go live on the 28th of June, so less than, 7 or 8 working days to go, so lots of activity going on. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I think these slides will be sent out later, so I won't go into the detail of here. Some of the key points of difference, I think, perhaps are in referrals. So it's expected the vast majority, probably 90% or so of people coming onto this programme will come through what's called a warm handover. So people won't just be sent to Restart. There'll be a collaborative and more engaging process between the Job Centre Plus work coach, the individual and the provider to have a conversation prior to the individual being referred over, so they've got a much better understanding of what support they'll get on Restart and what they can expect. So we're hoping that means the engagement rates and people actually moving from referral actually onto provision will be much better than perhaps it has been on previous programs. There's then a range of tailored supports coming from diagnostic assessments on that. Everybody going on Restart there's a minimum service standard that everybody is seen face to face in person at least once a month as a minimum service criteria. Beyond that, it'll be a flex of face to face digital telephony support. And then probably on exits, the important thing to show on this programme starts to address some of what Stephen mentioned there, is the outcome payments for providers is supporting individuals to achieve what's known as the earnings threshold. So from joining programme, from when moving into work, the individual needs to move to earnings £3,700 for it to be registered as an outcome. And that's largely predicated on minimum wage, 16 hours per week for 26 weeks is where that figure comes from. So that's the overall design of the programme. So if we can move on to the next stage. So in terms of Maximus, this is what we've got across the UK. So we're delivering as the prime contractor in South and East London. We're also the prime contractor in South and West Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and we've also got some subcontracting work in Wales and the West Midlands as well. So we're a fairly sizable provider of Restart in terms of the marketplace. If we can move on. So this is a bit more detail in terms of how we'll be delivering in South and East London. It gives an example of how we're organising ourselves. So these are the boroughs in this particular CPA where you've got the purple numbers. That's where there will be a permanent fixed location, a central office, and then where you've got the green numbers, that's where there's more outreach. There'll be more points beyond this. This was at the bid stage, and then what you've got at the top of this slide is, yes, Maximus is the prime contractor, but we will be delivering this contract through a team of subcontracting organisations as well. And the organisations we're working in partnership with are listed there. We've got 2 local authorities, a relatively small size provider, GetSet UK, but high quality, and then another scalable provider in Reading Partnership. So good mix in our supply chain to be able to deliver it. That's also reflected in our other prime contract in the north, where we've got some subcontractors as well. If we can move on. So in terms of some of the principles that are behind our own delivery, so work first approach. So this is all about getting people into sustainable work. That's the absolute priority. So everything we're going to do on this contract is measured towards that outcome. We have, however, got in place something that we're calling the system of support. So once the employment advisor is the key caseworker or key worker who drives forward the claimant's journey towards employment, we have around that whole network of support to also provide things like digital skills for digital inclusion. We've got some health and wellbeing coaches to support people. We've got skills coaches, and we've got a big partnership network, which I'll come back to in a second. In our delivery model, we're sorry, if we can just go back to the previous slide. In our particular model, we're using behavioural science to try and use quite a lot of nudge techniques. That's something that's been kicking around the health and wellbeing agenda for quite a long time. Hasn't really appeared in employment, but we're introducing behavioural science into our programme. And I've already mentioned digital enablement is a key part of our programme. So face-to-face delivery, but also online self-service where you can. And if we can go to the next slide, then so the locally integrated partnership network is a big part of our delivery model. This is something we've developed in previous programs in Wales and Scotland in particular, but we are putting in place a pretty substantial partnership network of community organisations, statutory service organisations, local authorities, charities and private organisations as well, designed to be a collective that signs up to the principles of Restart and provides all of those wraparound services and support services that an individual needs, particularly in a post-pandemic world. As we move forward, going forward. So, we've got a number of principles built into the partnership network. So principles of co-location wherever possible, cross referrals wherever possible. Anybody who's a member of the network should be better off as a result of being a member of the network. It really is about joining up community support and making sure services are aligned, not duplicated. And the way we're going to see this, you'll see there's independent oversight on the right-hand side. We'll have a board in place, an independent board that will be made up of community partnership network members who we will invite to hold us to account in terms of the quality of what we're delivering in a locality, how we're investing the monies that we've got available, and making sure that we've got equality and parity of service to all the different diverse groups of people that Restart will need to support. So I think this is one of our USPs. I think we're going to do this a bit different from how other providers might do, but this is our particular approach. So if we move forward a slide, I won't go through the detail of this, but within there, we've got a whole range of providers who provide a whole range of services, and I can go back into that more later if we can. If we go to the next slide, please. So I think fundamentally important to Restart is employer engagement. So we do have a reasonably well-developed employer approach where we're looking at key accounts for more strategic employers. We've got volume-based local employer engagement, recognising that the labour market is primarily made up of SMEs, and how do we engage with that? And then also how we engage with local networks of employers and agencies. And I've got on the right there some of the agencies that we would hope to do. Mark, I think hopefully you'll notice I've got London First in there, and we can have a conversation after this call if that's helpful. So engaging employers is a really important part of what we're doing. So that is an absolutely very high level, quick trip through what Restart is and how Maximus plans to deliver the service. I'm conscious of time, so I think I'll stop there, and I'm more than happy to take any questions as we move on.
Great, thanks, Gareth. I think that's a really helpful overview of the programme, and then also the sorts of approaches you're taking. And I can see there's some questions starting to come through in the chat, which we'll kind of pick up through the discussion. So do keep posting those away. And I particularly want to ask, I think, about the community partnership network, because I think one of the criticisms of some previous DWP programmes is that they've kind of parachuted them in from Mars almost, and then it's kind of, well, how does this fit into everything else? So that kind of feels like part of your proposed answer to that, so it'd be good to get into some of that. So yeah, do keep voting away on the poll, and also sort of putting in your questions on the Q&A as well. But Mark, I'll come on to you next. I won't ask you to comment on your being named on that previous slide, but be very interested in your perspective about how Restart works with employers and the other things we're asking of employers as well, how we meet employers' needs, but also how you think employers should engage too.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And thanks, Gareth, for putting our name on there. One of my points that I'll get to in a minute is about business engagement. So you've kind of anticipated that. So as Stephen said at the outset, London First business membership organisation. So I'm going to come at this from a business perspective. We're a kind of advocacy body at London First. We work with corporate business, City Hall in London, local councils, as well as central government as well. So it's very much from that angle, that kind of advocacy angle, rather than a delivery angle, that I'm going to make my points today. The first thing I want to do is just build on briefly Stephen's points about the labour market and the recent stats. So London has always been a kind of, in recent memory at least, a city of two halves. Just as many challenges as you got successes. You know, on the one hand, higher share of employment in high skilled occupations compared to the rest of the UK, which has, you know, been helpful for London with remote working in many ways over the last year. High level of qualifications than in any other region, more grads than any other city in the world. But on the other hand, unemployment has always outstripped most other regions in the UK, always been high amongst the young, the ethnically diverse communities in London, and disabled Londoners. In-work poverty rates are far too high in London, and we face, perhaps surprisingly, one of the greatest skill shortages of any region in the UK. And of course, London's been hit really hard by the pandemic. I mean, it's quite curious. London in recessions is often the place that that comes back first, goes into recession first, and comes out first. But that's not the case at the moment. Unemployment is still trending pretty high, particularly amongst young Londoners, Black Londoners, really high. You know, that long-term unemployment is a real challenge, and partly this is to do with the kind of service economy, particularly in the kind of central activity zone in London, which, you know, I was walking around Oxford Street yesterday and just seeing the number of restaurants and shops boarded up at the moment, it is just quite scary. So you've got, on the one hand, lots of businesses who have failed, but on the other hand, some businesses trying to reopen and desperate for recruits, but really struggling to find the right recruits. And then you've got you know, lots of young people, adults, desperate to get into work, and you know, it's not quite connecting as we would want it to. So, as with always the case with skills, the issues aren't particularly new, the solutions aren't particularly new, but urgent action is needed. Business, government, education, third sector has to work together now better than they have done before. You know, the issues are more pressing, they're deeper, there's more at stake here. So this is now the time to finally try and get some traction on some of those asks that we've all been pushing for many years. And I'll come to some of those asks in a minute. So I will set out a few suggestions in general terms for what each of the main parties could do to help get Londoners back into jobs and good work. Lessons that can be taken here to inform the design of Restart, so business, education, and government. But I wanted to make a couple of kind of overarching points that are important for Restart and government's general approach to the labour market, first of all. And this kind of answers or addresses the points that Gareth was making a second ago. So point number one is that we need closer integration between DfE and DWP. So for far too long, employment support and skills have kind of been twin tracks, not really kind of aligning together. So we need better alignment, better integration, perhaps in the form of an effective joint minister who might work with a recovery minister. You know, we believe at London First that the UK London needs a recovery minister in the same way that we've got a vaccination minister. And we need someone cutting across those two departments who can then work with HMT, work with BAYS, coordinate the government's growth agenda, which was a bit absent in the skills white paper recently, those kind of alignments there. So we need that. The second point, the overarching point, is about the way that government asks business to engage on skills and employment programs. So business, as I've kind of indicated, has been in survival mode. They're focused on their bottom line at the moment, but right now business is being asked lots of things by government in this area: apprenticeships, T-level placements, kickstart, restart, traineeships, school engagement, local skills improvement plans, yada yada yada. So my point really is that these asks must be coordinated, the offer must be simple to understand, and the process streamlined of cumbersome bureaucracy. And this is a really important point for when Restart kicks in a couple of weeks. You've got to be conscious of everything else that business is doing and everything else that government wants business to do on skills. And, you know, I'm glad and I'm looking forward to my conversation with Gareth. I'm glad he mentioned this, but so far kind of government outreach to organizations like mine have been pretty minimal on Restart. So it will be surprising to me if there are many of our members who are across the detail of what Restart is all about. And so we need to do a bit more around the kind of outreach stuff, and we need to be cognizant about that kind of level of understanding and knowledge when we're trying to get business to engage in this. So going on briefly then to my general suggestions for each of those main actors for how we kind of address the issue around unemployment, good work, and the Restart role in all of that. So starting with business. So business is already doing a lot, I think, but it needs to do much more on skills and employment. So in terms of adult skills, employer investment in education and training has been falling over the last 10 years or so. And of course, skills training is an area where employer investment tends to decline in a recession, which isn't perhaps a surprise, but we do need that trend to reverse. You know, perhaps counterintuitively for business, now is the time to be putting that money into skills programs, training programs, whether it's for your existing employees and progressing them, or whether it's for new hire programs, outreach programs. Now is the time for boosting that that investment. And of course, you know, we've heard lots of research before about, you know, generational drivers for business and for new jobs. Younger generations, Generation Z, so forth, are much more attracted to employers who can show that they take learning and development seriously and have a meaningful program. So it's business sense really is the main point. And there are lots of things, of course, that government can do to help with that, and, you know, incentivizing that investment through tax credits. Look at ways to help keep labour costs down once furlough comes to an end through things like NI, employer contribution reductions, as an example. But despite all of that, you know, there are many things that many of our members at London First are doing that's good, and that we try to amplify at London First in the hope that that then rubs off on other businesses, and that good practice can be taken and run with elsewhere. Lots of our members are already engaging in Kickstart. You know, our members are corporate businesses. They've got the kind of structure to do that, and they're also contributed in other ways. And I'll just give 3 very short examples. Compass, the major catering firm, has recently launched a job program called Constellation, and they provide training to enable applicants to do a range of jobs in the Compass family on a flexible basis. So this is a really positive response to the gig economy challenge, and a helpful indicator of the design for Restart. Lloyds Banking Group said about identifying 10 key skills that employees would need to build for the future, including agile project management. And they are, but they've acknowledged that a lack of time is a barrier to employees training. So they are committing to delivering an additional 4.4 million hours of learning and development over the next 3 years. So they're putting in a really kind of ambitious program around training. And Thames Water, my third example of 3, is that they've recently launched an ambitious skills strategy. I know they've spoken in other learning and work institute events, but you know they're really ambitious around good work and have that at the heart of their strategy, which is around improving the diversity of their workforce. Really important, given that the hit that the pandemic has had, as I said earlier, on the ethnically diverse communities in London. They're trying to create careers and not jobs at Thames Water by investing in people and creating that culture of lifelong learning. And they're establishing those strategic skills partnerships with people on this call today. And fourthly, adopting that kind of leading position in the industry that they operate, and encouraging good practice down their supply chain as well. So some really ambitious stuff that's already happening in business, but could do more. Government, lots to do on government, but I've only got a couple more minutes, I think, so I'll be very quick.
Just 1 minute, tops, if you wouldn't mind, please, Gareth. Just sorry, in terms of time, Mark.
Yeah, no, I appreciate. Let's invest in a careers system, a careers service that actually does what it says on the tin. Let's unlock the National Skills Fund and start using that for a proper retraining scheme in London now. And let's inject some innovation into the Skills for Jobs white paper proposals. Let's learn from places like Singapore on what they're doing with learning credits and so forth. My final point is just around what education can do as well. The rules around funding and regulation get in the way. We need to address those, and we need education to have that commercial mindset when they're working through the local skills improvement plans and the SDFs. We really need education to be commercial. Let's get some secondments into business and help with that. But that's it in a very quick canter through. Thank you, Stephen. Back to you.
Fabulous, thank you, Mark. Lots for us to pick up there, and I can see the sort of questions coming through as well. We've got quite a lot that to get through about you know, the sort. I think you're right about the sort of you know, we've got this increased unemployment, but we've got then higher vacancies now. Good. And employers saying that they can't find people. I mean, in many ways, that makes it a good time to launch a new employment programme, because at least there's those opportunities there. But it's how do we link across? And then London, you know, is that going to be a bit different because it's so reliant on commuters and international travel? So I think it's a London specific question there, and then a few other things to pick up, which we will do in a second in the Q&A. But before we get onto that, and last call to vote in the poll, by the way, as well. Loads of you have already done so, but last call if you haven't. If I can bring in Kim to give your perspective from the Centre for Ageing Better.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me here. At the Centre for Ageing Better, our primary objective when we look at work is to see more older workers in the labour market for longer. Simple as that. And in preparation for this morning, Roisin gave me 3 bullets she'd like me to cover. I'm just going to use those as a framework for what I'm going to say. So her first point really was that I might like to give some evidence of why previous programmes have not worked for older job seekers. I get asked this question a lot, as you might imagine, and what's really interesting is there isn't much evidence, which is quite alarming really, because most of us that work in this environmental community know that previous programmes have not worked for this client group, and what's quite worrying is that fact has been accepted but not investigated. And so I really welcome this sort of conversation that we're having now and the approach to Restart, because one thing is very, very clear, and I think why I'm on this agenda is that you are the long-term unemployed are predisposed to be over 50. So the client group that we're going to see coming through this programme is going to be a significant proportion of it anyway, it's going to be over 50. So it's the older workers that we need to move back into the labour market. And we need to think about that in different ways, and we need to reflect on what's happened before. And I think what that fact that it hasn't been investigated says to us is that there's something that we need to tackle around culture, leadership, and attitudes to older workers. This isn't necessarily just a process thing. I do think that we need to tackle ageism itself, both in our advisors, in our process and service deliveries, and with employers. And I welcome discussions about that. I think it's going to be really interesting. You wouldn't believe this, but somebody's at my door. Excuse me, I'm really sorry.
Well, the joys of working from home. What we're going to do, just while we're waiting for Kim to find out, that may be somebody with the answer to why programs work less well for the over 50s. Whilst we're waiting for Kim to return, can I suggest that we perhaps close the poll and perhaps bring up the results from that to give Kim time to go and answer the door. So thank you everybody for voting. Loads of votes coming in. So a reminder, the question was, what do we need to do, or what more do we need to do so that Restart works? So if we can bring up the magic answers. So there you go, kind of so very few people saying, don't worry about it, we're all sorted here. I think that must be one person, so well done to you. But I think the two most popular responses there: greater role for skills and learning support, and also that focus on outcomes and getting employers to sign up to good work standards. So you know, some chunky votes for devolution there as well, but those are the two most popular results there. So we'll kind of maybe pick that up and look at that as we go into the questions and the debate. So thank you everybody for voting on that. So if you can take that poll down, please. Oh, there we go. I think I've timed that perfectly, Kim. That whoever was at the door has now gone. So
that's my postman. Perils of living in the countryside. So I'm very, very sorry, everyone. My second question was how to support good work for elder workers. And what I would say is I'm really pleased that this has been touched on by the previous speakers. Good programmes include interventions with the supply side and interventions with the demand side. So what we want to see in Restart is lots of activity with employers as well as activity with the client group. Just in that area, we have just conducted a YouGov survey with employers. We consulted 2,300 across all sectors. And what's really interesting is it's reinforced that I do firmly believe that at the minute we're going through, we've got a moment in time and an opportunity to make a step change with employers in terms of the Build Back piece. I absolutely think that we should have a minister focusing on this. I think it'd be great. But half of the employers that we consulted say that their organisation is going to develop an age inclusive strategy in the next 12 months, which I think is fantastic. And high numbers of them, actually, over 70%, value elder workers. Now that's quite an important message to get across to advisors as well, is actually, you know, employers are looking for elder workers as part of their workforce. And the reason they value them isn't just as workers themselves, but it's multi-generational workforces is something that people are really starting to see a strength in. And the value that an elder worker gives to a younger worker is really, really important. What is interesting though, although they value them, is there's a lot of stereotypes around. They think they cost more, which is interesting because they don't. They think they're likely to be stuck in their ways, and they think they're likely to be more suitable to managerial roles. So there's some stereotypes that we need to deal with in those conversations, but I think the door's open to educate and to invest in them. And what is also interesting is that the way that they want to talk about, to be given guidance of working with this group in particular, is, well, half of them said government guidelines are their most popular route way to get information. I think we do need a really strong voice from government about building back, and I wouldn't want to put older and younger employers in employees in any contest. I think multi-generational workforces and building back good diverse workforces is to be encouraged and should be flagship by government. Finally, Roisin's question to me was, how do we ensure work is flexible and fulfilling? There's a question. I don't actually think it's a question about elder workers. Good work is good work. And often when we look at the things that we want to see in an employment environment, they are good for everybody, not just for one particular group. I'm a really big fan of good work standards. I think that local government has a real role to play in place shaping and doing something about setting standards. And definitely employers themselves, you know, they respond to peer pressure and they are proud, and they do understand that their reputation is one of the factors that attracts the people to work with them. So I think, you know, that whole place is important, and I think it's a place that Mark is talked about, so I'm not going to talk about anymore. So that's me done, and I'm very sorry about the postman.
No, I'm amazed my doorbell. I think I've got a queue of delivery people forming at various points. This is one of the things that's happened in the last 14 months. Kim, perhaps I can come across to you to just ask the first questions. Lots of questions kind of coming through via the Q&A, and because you talked about, I think, you know, in my view, correctly, about sort of attitudes to age and age discrimination and lots of other things as well. Someone's said that they work with the over 50s, and is it often about lack of skills or industries people have been employed with that may not be there anymore, so, you know, mismatch there, and also potentially health issues as well. So it feels to me, this is going to be a leading question, I'm afraid, but it feels to me like a lot of the skills initiatives, there's not enough of them, there's not enough investment in skills, full stop, but also we make it harder to get any skills support the older you are, or if you need to retrain, which is probably the opposite of perhaps what we ought to be doing. So I get, how do we tie together that skills support with the employment support to tackle some of those challenges that the question is asked about?
I think when we're thinking about Restart, I think the whole thing about the overarching Restart framework is that they manage that environment to suit the customer. So I think one of the big risks for older workers is that they're going to be signposted to skills. And one of the reasons older workers drop out of skills training in this area is because the way it's delivered is for young people. It's a big classroom in a further education college that somebody that's come from a school environment recently is really comfortable in, and an older worker finds quite foreign. And so I think a big challenge for Restart providers is ensuring that their partners are delivering in the culture and the product to the customer to the standard that they want. And you know, just shipping somebody out of a really comfortable environment that's been tailored to them into the old school is not going to be the solution. I think we've got to look at that quite carefully.
Great, thanks, Kim. And I'll perhaps come across to Mark next. I want to ask you in a moment just about how we make it simple for employers, because I think you kind of described the sort of bamboozlement and the bombardment of initiatives and what, you know, people are actually busy running their businesses, which is tough enough. But first, I was kind of really interested that you picked up about employer investment in skills, for example, has fallen over the last 10 years and is lower than lower than the EU average. This also gives me an opportunity to plug a forthcoming Learning and Work Institute report in a few weeks' time about this. But within those totals, we know that those with the lowest skills and those in the most insecure work, and those who are therefore also most likely to have lost their jobs in the pandemic, for example, are least likely to get training at work. And also government policy increasingly just passively supports those inequalities rather than trying to tackle them. So I'm kind of interested, what more do you think we should be asking employers to do, and how do we persuade employers of that case to take on previously unemployed people and also to invest more in training?
I think, you know, the example that Lloyd's have gone down is a good one. You know, they've recognised that they needed to step up, and around employer training, they recognised that their business was changing and their skills needs were changing. You know, as kind of the financial services industry, technology changes, skills around project management, data analysis change, and they recognised rightly that if they don't grip this, then it's, you know, it's a business competitiveness issue for them. They will be left behind. You know, they're all kind of our members are all, you know, let's take tech and kind of data science as a good example. Our members are all fishing in a very small pool of people at the moment who have those types of skills, in a world where, you know, in the future 90% of all jobs will require a degree of digital skills. And you know, it's helping businesses to recognize the importance of being ahead of the curve here, and that by investing in your staff, then it kind of gives you that competitive edge. And and this is what I do as a member representative organization. This is what I do by bringing in external speakers and meeting our business members to try and land the point that skills training investment isn't a kind of CSR thing. It's a business critical thing, in the same way as investing in proper approach to inclusion and diversity. You have to do it, and as the world of work changes, you really have to embrace it. So the more people who say that to business, and the more businesses who say it to each other, the better. And the government are kind of doing the right things in some ways. The local skills improvement plans is a good case in point. Whether it's ambitious enough or radical enough, that's probably for another conversation. But the government have listened to business moaning for years about wanting an employer-led skill system. Okay, business, now's the time to kind of get involved and play your part and build on everything you're already doing and kind of work together as businesses.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think the sort of I think that's a really the idea of putting the challenge back, say, well, you asked for this, you've got it now, kind of what you're going to do, and then also the kind of the business case and that coming from other businesses rather than. I remember when I was working as part of London government, we had businesses talking to other businesses about, Kim will remember this, engaging in employment support, and that's kind of more powerful than me as a civil servant at the time rocking up to tell private sector businesses, this would be very good for them, really. So I think two really important, powerful points there in particular. And if I can sort of go across to Gareth next, I get there's quite a few questions come up on a similar sort of range of themes, and it's almost the flip side a bit of what Mark was talking about there, about there's so much stuff going on, how are employees supposed to engage and how's it driven to them. It's more some of these questions are more about how Restart fits with ESF funded provision, for example, and also Kickstart. So are people going to get a choice between which one they end up on, or how are we going to make sure it's a joined up offer and the person gets to the right provision? So I just wonder, from your perspective, from the plans that you set out for delivery, how do you see trying to hide that wiring a little bit and make sure the right people end up in the right places?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we're not operating in a perfect world, unfortunately. So I think many of those questions there is not clarity on still, even with the proximity of Restart starting in 2 weeks. So, for example, it's still not clear how Kickstart and Restart sit alongside each other when somebody gets a choice or can be on both programs or not. So our approach will be not to parachute into an area and then impose restarts on everything. Our approach is very much around, starting having a really meaningful dialogue locally with what provision already exists. So you heard me talk about our community partnership network. The whole point of that is to make sure there's no duplication of provision wherever possible, because there is limited funds available for what's available. So where we've worked best with community partnership networks in the past is where we are able to provide a network of organizations together who are able to articulate what their current offers are. And then what we would do is say, well, actually, how can that integrate with Restarts, and how can we join that up? We would then look for gaps in provision and say, where's there a provision that doesn't exist? So one of the commitments we've made in our Restart bid, I think we've put aside a budget of £5 million, just over £5 million, to spend on funding for gaps in provision. So picking up Kim's point, if there isn't, if there's a demonstrable need for a particular solution for, older workers or older unemployed people in a particular part of London, and there isn't suitable provision in place, we've put money aside to be able to invest in that and start to set some of that provision up. So that's some of that, how we're looking to plug the gaps. But in order to plug gaps, we kind of need to know what exists in the first place. So we as part of our infrastructure, will have a head of community partnerships and a partnership network team whose sole role will be to go out and talk to community organisations to try and get some kind of mapping exercise done of what already exists. Now, we're not starting that from new. We've already had meetings, for example, representatives from local London and South London Partnership to understand what that is. We're already an existing provider in East London and Reed in South London, so we've already got some of that. But I think we need to move that to another level now. And Restart is the scalable contract which allows that to happen. So for me, it's really important not to duplicate provision, because there isn't enough money to go around, and therefore we need to make sure the provision is targeted and aligned. So we're not looking to compete with other provision. I say that. In reality, that can sometimes be difficult because everybody's got contract targets, but our spirit is to come into this collaboratively.
Thanks, Gareth. And I guess it's sort of follow on from that. I mean, that's a good practical example of that community partnership network that you talked about, I think. There's a kind of couple of questions about the economic context, and it's sort of, it's like crystal ball time. But I know one of the challenges around the work programme was there was a gap between the work programme starting and the previous programmes finishing, which meant the Job Centre Plus had loads more people to refer onto the work programme at the start than anyone was expecting, and that did affect service standards for those people joining in the early days. And then it dropped off because the good news, the economy was doing better, and so there were issues about referral numbers, and then were the people getting referred suitable, and all these kind of things. It was a bit of a boom and a bust thing. So I guess looking at the numbers, just as an outsider, it looks to me like we're going to have really high potential numbers of referrals in the first 3 months or so of the programme, because long-term unemployment is already up 37%, as I said. And then we've got the end of furlough at the end of September, which potentially, depending on, if people more people lose their jobs there, then sort of 12 months after that, you've got a potential other spike. But in between, if things aren't going swimmingly, a potential dip down. So I'm just interested in your perspective about those risks of sort of boom and bust. I may have got it wrong, but that kind of risk of boom and bust, and sort of how you're handling that and making sure you've got the expertise there, but without sort of overstaffing for numbers that may not be there in 6 months.
Yeah, so our approach as a provider, whenever we start up a program, we tend to overstaff anyway, on the basis that you don't know what volumes you're going to get, and actually, if you don't quite get the volumes you anticipate, you should be able to give an even better quality of service and get your contract off to a good start. So traditionally, that's how we would operate. Interestingly, the contracts that the department has agreed with providers demands that providers staff up to significant numbers from day one of provision, and I think every provider will be over-resourced from day one. And I think that's a deliberate move from the department to make sure providers have invested up front to make sure the service is available. In terms of the ramp up of the programme, it's a 6-month graduated ramp up with the department, so at every contract area. So in month 1, when we go live in July, effectively, we'll only get a 6. So we've got a sort of an optimum level of referral volumes per month. So let's say that's 3,000, for example. In month 1 of the programme, we'll get 500 referrals. In month 2, we'll get 1,000. In month 3, we'll get 1,500. It'll go up in blocks of 500. And then by the time you're in month 7, you're at full rate of referrals. And the department has agreed with Job Centre Plus a managed process of managing those referrals to providers. So it's actually quite a sensibly controlled process to start with. Once we're into live running, Stephen, I think it depends on what the economic situation is. I mean, from where I'm sat, I think we think the numbers are probably going to be strong in years 1 and 2 of the programme, because, in anticipation, as you say, of the end of furlough. I think as a provider, if there's a risk on us as a provider, the risk probably comes by year 3, because if economic recovery does take place in line with projections, then arguably the numbers of long-term unemployed people should diminish in a couple of years' time. But that's a risk that we take on as a provider. We take on and either reduce volumes, or you get a slightly different cohort of people. But of course, outside of Restart, other programs continue. Programs like Work and Health program continue. JETS is possibly going to get extended for a period of time to take the short-term impact of furlough. You've got other programs like IPES. So there's other provision out there. That's DWP provision I've referenced, not local provision. So I think we've just got to go in with open eyes, and as a provider, you've got to be agile enough to respond to volume changes, but going back to Kim's point again, demographic changes. If we see a particular influx of older people or younger people or people from particular communities, then we've got to be able to be agile enough to respond to that.
Thanks, Gareth. That's really helpful, and I think some really good examples there of DWP and its design and commissioning, learning from some of the experience of the work programme. And similarly, I think it's more of a grey box than a black box this time, isn't it, with sort of some more centrally set service standards, for example. So I think there's some really good lessons that have been learned across. We're into the, believe it or not, we're into the last 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask each of you a last question, but I'm telling you that also because you can then also shoehorn in the answer any other point that you wanted to get in, which is what I normally do on these things. So perhaps Mark, if I start with you. I mean, my last question was about what more should we be asking of employers. I guess the kind of flip side of that, as you talked about as well, is the offer to employers. And it does feel just massively complicated, and employers, as I say, are busy trying to get on with running their businesses. So from your perspective, what can Restart do, and what can central and local government do to try and make that offer a bit simpler and easier to access, and not sort of a massed array of acronyms with a phone call from a different agency every other day?
Yeah, and this goes to my point about kind of joined up DWP and DFE. I mean, essentially, you need a good, decent marketing campaign here. And I'm imagining a kind of infographic with each of the programs that government is running down one side, T-level placements, apprenticeships, et cetera, with a kind of, these are the things you'll get as a business from this. These are the asks that we have of you, employer, and this is who you speak to find out more. Maybe more than one side of an infographic, but it's that kind of thing. And I think the Home Office actually have been doing their kind of marketing campaign around the new points-based system, immigration system, and the whole settled status, getting Europeans to kind of register pretty well, actually, and pushing out information through all of their networks, including London First, and making it kind of punchy and digestible. That's what we need. Something here, something that brings everything together in one place.
Fabulous, thanks, Mark. And Kim, on to you next. You talked a little bit before about attitudes to people over 50, whether that's employers but also providers and all the rest of it. How can we go about changing some of those perceptions and assumptions?
Well, I think one of the things that Restart has done is look at, and DWP have done, is look at contact rates, and they have tried to tackle parking, I think, with stricter, and I think that's quite a good thing, because I think that's what happened for lots of good reasons. I think people, in terms of their state of mind, in terms of how people think of other older people, there's still a lot of view that actually conditionality is hassle, and let's not hassle these people who probably want to retire. I am a really big fan of conditionality being applied to all groups, but the sanctions probably are too punitive. And if you're not in a conditionality regime, you're going to miss out. So I think that's the first thing, is to give people more time to talk to people, but then to help advisors with that conversation. So actually, Job Centre Plus have just done a pilot in East Anglia where they've case-loaded elder workers, and the advisors that volunteered to run those caseloaders were given additional capacity and capability building. So they were given access to lots of training themselves around pensions, around what the sort of support this group will need. And that did result in better offloads, actually. So I think that capacity and capability building of advisors would tackle ageism as well. So just a bit of focus generically across all of the advisor base, but then building some specialisms and perhaps having some champions for this particular group, given the size of the group. And the little thing I wanted to sneak in that I didn't say in my place was, it's very, very sad that the employment bill has been postponed. And I think that is something that we want to see government get on with, and that's where the voice would be. And the sooner that gets back on the table, the better.
Yes, well, yes, very good point. That feels like our next event. Thank you, Kim. And lastly, just a quick last word to Gareth. I guess you've got lots of different types of people on this event, but that includes lots of people who are running different types of provision, whether it's in your contract package areas or elsewhere. I guess what would be your key message to people in terms of how they could work with you or the other Restart providers if they're in a different area?
I think that's a great question, actually. So I think obviously, I don't know if everybody knows who the Restart, but it's been on the government website. So I don't know if government what details out there actually. So, but I think the key thing for a Restart provider, it's about agility. Because we're in a strange world, aren't we? We're post-pandemic and we don't quite know what's going to happen. Have we really seen any impact of Brexit yet? I'm not sure we have, and that's a layer that's been forgotten in all of this. I think we need to. So on the demand side and the employer side, I think we'll see lots of labour market changes. Some of those labour market changes will be highly localised. So I think we've got to be prepared to adapt to that. On the supply side, I think we need to see, what happens in terms of long-term unemployment. Who are the cohorts ultimately, the medium and long-term most affected? We can anticipate that, but we need to see that come to reality. So you've got to be able to be agile enough to do all of that. And then for me, you need to be able to connect in with all the local service providers to be able to. So what we do in East London, for example, may be quite different to what we do in Yorkshire, because the service environment is different. So if anybody wants to work with us, I think the slides have been distributed. My own contact details were on the slide deck. I'm very happy then to pass any referrals or contacts on to the team that we've got in London now. We're just in the process of, it's only a 9-week implementation window, which possibly is why not many people have heard that much about Restart, because it's moving at a heck of a pace. So one of the things we need to do once we've got the team in place is get the word out there about how people can get in touch with us, because that's not really happened, to be honest with you, yet.
Fabulous. Thank you
for today, because that gives me a great opportunity to get it out there.
I mean, there's lots of takeaways from today's event, but I think one of the key ones for me is quite how calm you are, given you've got 8 working days till go live. So that's excellent.
Yeah, well, we're working with a lot of good organisations, so yeah.
Fabulous. Well, thank you to Kim and to Mark and to Gareth for giving up your time today and for engaging in lots of issues that we've kind of got into, and a massive thank you to everybody who's dialed into the event as well. And there's kind of, I think, 52 questions came through in the end, so I tried to get through as many as possible and group them together, but thank you for that, and the voting in the poll and the engagement more generally. I think that shows what an important topic this is, both Restart specifically, but also support for the people who are long-term unemployed, and that promoting a better labour market for the future as well. So we're going to be doing tons more on this. I'm sure everyone who's involved in this event will be as well. A big thank you to Rasheen and Mintra, the Learning and Work team, who organised all of this and make it run so smoothly. So big thank you to them. So thank you all very much. We look forward to carrying on working with you.